nothing more beautiful than being surprised by the gospel. Those are words of Pope Benedict XVI on the day of his inauguration in 2005. There's nothing more beautiful than being surprised by the gospel. When you came last week, we had our first session on Matthew's gospel. Were you surprised? And were you surprised at what you were surprised about? This week I'm going to sort of suggest things which I would hope you'll be surprised by and beautifully surprised by. In studying the Gospel of Matthew, we have to take in mind the Gospel of Mark, because Mark is the source Gospel. And what I'm going to be pointing to more than anything, as I did was last week, is how does Matthew, I could say enhance, I could say simply change, add to, take away from the Gospel of Mark. What is different in the Gospel of Matthew? Okay, so we're looking for specific things. And of course, the first thing that you remember from last week is, of course, there were the infancy stories and there were the Magi. There was the Sermon on the Mount and other things that we went through. And by the way, you're soon going to be able to see it on the internet. I think you already can. So if you want to check out what I said last week, be my guest. Okay. I said at the end of last week that we've got to chapter 16, which was pretty good going, even though we actually jumped quite a few chapters towards the end. Chapter 16 contains the confession of faith of St. Peter. Right? When Jesus says, "Who do people say I am?" And then he says, "Who do you say I am?" And it is Peter that says, "You are the Christ." Okay? Now that is in the account in the Gospel of Mark. If we look at Matthew, Matthew has done some very interesting things to the text of Mark. So if you want to note down the references, this is Mark 8, 27 to 33, and Matthew 16, 13 to 23. Okay. One of the things I said about the overall structure of Mark and Matthew was that Mark, if he has a structure at all, it's a kind of geographical structure, but it becomes a theological structure. His gospel, the first 8 chapters, are located in the north, around Galilee. And then from chapter 8, and precisely from this passage, Jesus begins his journey towards Jerusalem. So that's the geographical process, getting to Jerusalem and what happens in Jerusalem. But it's also a theological or Christological development, because what happens from chapter 8 onwards is that Mark focuses our attention on the coming death of Jesus. We have what are called the Passion predictions. Okay. Matthew adopts that basic structure. Do you remember that? So Matthew adopts it and actually introduces it more formally. If you remember in chapter 4, verse 17, from that time Jesus began to preach. Actually, we had it last Sunday in the Gospel. He began to preach and to say, "Repent, the kingdom of heaven is coming." That's 4:17. That's the beginning of the Galilee ministry in Matthew, corresponding to 1 to 8 in Mark. From 16 onwards, at 16:21, we have the statement, "From that moment, Jesus began to demonstrate to the disciples that he had to suffer." Okay, so we've got the same division into 2 halves. that we had in Mark. And this point, this text which we're looking at, Peter's confession, what's known as Peter's confession, begins or contains that going from the first to the second stage. Okay. The text of Peter's confession has two parts. First of all, who do you say I am, leading to the declaration of faith of Peter, you are the Christ. And the second part is the first prediction of the passion. So in itself, it's a Christological statement. So yes, he is the Christ, but the Christ will suffer. You might say that that is the essence of the Gospel of Mark. Get your head round this, Peter. No, it's not what is expected of the Messiah. When we get into Matthew, so in Matthew 16, there are various changes. Okay? Hope this is not too complex. Chapter 16, we have the questions of Jesus. Who do people say I am? We have, who do you say I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Okay, that is in verse 16. If you've got your Bibles, just check I'm okay with that. 16. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's the Son of God. Mark didn't have him say that, but Matthew is enhancing this statement of Peter. He's enhancing it with a declaration of faith, which we've already heard from the disciples. Uniquely, the story of the walking on the water. This is 14 verse... I will give it to you just a moment. Sorry? 33. 14:33, at the end of the walking on the water, they all said, the disciples said, truly you are the Son of God. So in Matthew, it comes before the profession of faith of Peter, which in Mark's Gospel is the sort of climax, and Peter is the spokesman. And that happens in chapter 16 in Matthew. But in chapter 14, they've already said it. I think you could do a study of the Son of God in Matthew's Gospel. Who says it? First of all, the disciples together. Then Peter, and then, we'll come back to this in half an hour's time, the centurion and those who were with him. Okay? So these statements of the faith of the church. It's one thing to say he's the Christ, but to say he's the Son of God enhances this statement of Christian faith in a way that Mark doesn't contain at this point. The other thing that we have, and the things that are surprising us about what Matthew has done to Mark's account, is of course the statement of Jesus. Once Peter has said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus answered only in Matthew, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I say to you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And on it goes. Okay, so there is a consequence of Peter's faith that's not contained in Mark. Mark, it simply goes on. Jesus tells them, don't say anything about this, and he began to teach them about his coming suffering. But in Matthew, we have this continuing dialogue between Jesus and Peter, in which Peter is commissioned, and it is said to Peter, on this rock I will build my church. That's obviously a hugely important text in Christian tradition, because it's mentioning ecclesia, church, mentioned twice in Matthew, again in chapter 18, as the assembly. And how does the gospel, how do the Christians who embrace the gospel form an assembly, a community, an ecclesia, which is the people gathered together in faith. And of course, that is very important for church teaching on the church, on the papacy. You go to St. Peter's, around the central altar you've got tu es Petrus, super hanc Petrem, edificabo ecclesiam meam. In other words, the Latin version of that text. So for Catholics, this is a big text. It's not the only big Petrine text. Think of the end of John's Gospel, we think of texts in Luke's Gospel, but it's obviously, that is an issue which is being addressed based on the way that Jesus chose Peter to have a special mission. Okay, so this is the text of the turning point, Matthew 16. What are we surprised by? We're surprised by this statement of Peter's mission, Peter's role in the church. But we're going to be surprised by something else, not quite so positive. Because if you go on, as I said to you, we have, from that time onwards, Jesus began to talk to them about the Passion. This is the same text of Matthew 16, which reflects Mark 8, but is making it far more complex. And we have the reaction of Peter to the prospect of the suffering of Jesus. In Mark, Peter began to rebuke Jesus. You can't say this. This can't happen to you. This is not the way of the Messiah. In Matthew's Gospel, not only do we have that, but we have the statement, we have it in Mark. He turns and rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." That's Mark. But in Matthew, "You are a hindrance in my path. You are a scandalon, a stumbling stone, something, you are a scandal." Okay? He's only just appointed Peter to have this role in the church, and the next moment, you are a scandal. Okay? Only in Matthew. So when we're thinking about church, when we're thinking about the role of the leader, it's not only, it's wonderful that you have this faith and you're going to have this wonderful position, it's also, be careful, because you can become a stumbling stone for others. We've seen that. We know the history of the Catholic Church. All the wonderful leaders that we've had, and the occasional not very good leader. It's even true in 2020. Okay, so we've got to this halfway mark in Matthew, all right? But the other thing which I told you last week was that if we look at the structure of Matthew, we also have these 5 discourses. Remember? The 5 speeches solemnly introduced and then ending with the words, "And when Jesus had finished this, he did something else." So we have the 5 speeches, the first one being the Sermon on the Mount, the second one being the mission discourse, third one being the parables. You remember the parables, chapter 13? This is all stuff we did last week in great detail. So we've had 3 of them. The 4th discourse is going to come in chapter 18, and the 5th one in chapters 24 and 25. So just to sort of remind us of that, of this amazing construction which respects and develops Mark, but also is able to superimpose, to add to Mark, these 5 discourses. Why 5? Because Jesus is the new Moses. This is the new law, the new Pentateuch. Okay. We have to put those to one side because we can't deal with everything. And I want to spend some time on the Passion story of Matthew because we're going to be hearing it on Palm Sunday. So during these chapters, as in Mark, Jesus is making this journey towards Jerusalem. And as in Mark, we have the 3 solemn predictions of the Passion, statements of the coming Passion and death and resurrection. I want to alert you, though, to what I think is one of the most extraordinary additions to Matthew's Gospel, which doesn't really fit into the structures that I've talked about. But if you go to chapter 20 of Matthew, we have this unique parable. By unique, I mean you won't find it in any other gospel. It's the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And you know the story. It all seems very unjust. The ones that worked the whole day get the same as the ones only come at the last 10 minutes. And then we have this statement. This is in verse 11. When the first came, they expected to get more, but they too received only 1 denarius, like the others. They took it, but they grumbled at the landowner. They grumbled at the landowner. The word grumble in Greek is gonguzo. Gonguzo. A gonguzon. You can tell it's something not very nice. A gonguzon. So they took it and grumbled. And this is just the word that we have in the introduction to chapter 15 of Luke, which you know is the lost sheep, the lost coin, prodigal son. Jesus tells those parables because people were grumbling that he was associating with tax collectors and sinners. Right? Okay. So this is, I remember my dear mother saying to me once that we had this gospel. I think it comes during summer holidays, and we had this gospel. I said Mass for her, and she said, I don't really know what that's about. It doesn't seem very right to me. Which, of course, is exactly what you would say. And if you're an upright, just person, you'd say, hang on, that's not right. They shouldn't have the same. And that's precisely what is shaking our ideas about God, that we've sorted out God's justice and this is what God is to be. And we find that God is far more generous. That's what the parable suggests. That is what Jesus seems to be suggesting to us, just as the son who's wasted all the money comes back and gets a party. And the elder son, of course, is like those who complain. Can't get his head round it. Of course, we don't know what happens in the very end beyond the parable. We'd like to imagine that he came to his senses and went in as well. That's what I think, because, we can fear that we're actually that person. So to go into the party, we need to accept that there's people there who, in our eyes, might not deserve to be there, but in God's eyes are better than us, or, well, don't have to say better or worse. Okay, so that's chapter 20. Right, let's move on then. Chapter 21, Jesus enters Jerusalem, and there is looking for beautiful things that Matthew's brought in. Let's just look. There's just one thing I want to show you. And what I invite you to do is discover these beautiful things for yourself, because this list is very sort of personal to me. It's not that, these are the things that are the most striking. I just think that some of them are. Chapter 21, entering Jerusalem, Palm Sunday. So look out for this when we have the reading before the procession of the palms. Okay? Chapter 21, verse 10 and 11. And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, as people asked, "Who is this?" And the crowds answered, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." It's the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee, which I think is the most fantastic. It's only in Matthew. You think, he's the prophet. He must be a prophet. A great prophet has risen among us. And he's from Nazareth. What? Does anything good come from Nazareth? Of course it doesn't. So it's a wonderful touch. I always have a smile when I read that. I must remember to have a smile this year. Okay. Then we're in Jerusalem. We have the final of the 5 discourses, the discourse which includes that scene of the Last Judgment in chapter 25. And I want with that to come back to a word that I mentioned last week, which was the word dikaios, just or righteous. Remember that Joseph was described as being a just man. Okay? And then in the Sermon on the Mount, we had, unless your justice is greater than that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So justice, the Greek root dikaios, dikaiosune, I've noted how this recurs in the Gospel of Matthew in a way that it doesn't in the other Gospels. So the people who are welcomed into the kingdom, the Last Judgment, are known as the dikaioi. Right? We have righteous. I don't like the translation righteous. It's a very English translation. It's in all the English, from the King James Version. And unfortunately, Henry's put it in the Revised New Jerusalem Bible. He's got righteous and the right. And I said, no, it's just. The just, because then you can make the connection with justice. Righteousness gets a bit heavy in my understanding. So there we are. You never get the translation right. That's right. Yeah. Some of you were asking last week, Dom Henry Wandsworth had a public occasion in which he talked about his translation. He was interviewed also by Father Nicholas King, so it was very, very interesting. And one of the points that I'm making, well, every translation is a failure. They didn't use the word failure, but they might have done. Yeah. Every translation doesn't work. The only way to get to it is get to the original language, and then you've still got problems. Because you might not know what a word means, or you might not know whether that word is genuine because another copy says something different. So this is the weakness of being human and using human language. This is the way in which God says, well, I'm going to try and get something across to you, but with your language and your hard hearts and all the rest of it, you might struggle to understand it. Okay, so when we start gonguzoing, when we start complaining, we know that actually there's something there which we ought to be taking in, or at least considering a bit more seriously than simply dismissing. Oh, we can't have that. Okay, so that's the final speech. Now, when you get to the end of the final speech of the 5, which is 24-25, actually it spills into chapter 26, and this is the beginning of the Passion narrative. It says, when Jesus had finished all these sayings. Okay? So every one of those 5 discourses ends when Jesus had finished, and then something, all these parables, or all this teaching. 26, all these sayings. He's finished. This is the end of the teaching of Jesus, and we go into the story of the Passion, what's known as the Passion narrative. Each gospel has a passion narrative. We could say that I think we would say it is the most important part of the gospel story, because if you go back to the Acts of the Apostles or to St. Paul, you find that that's what they are preaching. No? He was put to death, but God raised him from the dead. It's all about death and resurrection. That's what is crucial to us. That's what we celebrate in every Eucharist, in every sacrament. Baptism, we die in order to rise again. So, if it's so important in the preaching, this is pure speculation, but some scholars have said, well, it must have been the first thing to be developed in a story, or it must have been the first thing that they really wanted to record, the events of the death of Jesus. Okay? So, if we look at the 4 Gospels, it's much the same as with a lot of the other Gospel material. There are the 3 synoptics, and there is John. Okay? I think with the with the Passion story, though, I'd want to say there's Matthew, Mark, there's Luke, and there's John. John is a completely different ball game. So do come to listen to Victor Darlington, because I'll ask him to say something particular about the Passion story. So if we put that to one side, why is it different? Because the theology becomes much more obvious. The person of Jesus, the truth about Jesus, becomes much more obvious. When they go to arrest him in the garden, they fall at his feet. No? That's John. Because the reality is that's what they should be doing. Okay. Then the other three, with Mark and Matthew, we can do what we've done so far and be surprised by Matthew and what Matthew does to Mark. Okay? With Luke, we've got quite a few particular touches which you need to look at, not next year, but the year after. Next year will be Mark. This year's Matthew, next year's Mark. The year after will be the Gospel of Luke. Okay, so the question I'm asking now is, what is characteristic of Matthew's presentation of the Passion? So we've already got one thing, which is the final discourse spills over into the chapter 26. When he'd finished all this, well, it would be good to have the complete citation of that, because so if we go to Matthew 26, so 26, 27 is the Passion story. In each Gospel it's 2 chapters, followed by the final chapter, which is resurrection, except in the case of John, is followed by 2 chapters. Okay, so 26. Jesus had now finished all he wanted to say. And he told his disciples, you know that after 2 days it will be Passover. I would like Henry to have translated that more literally, because that formula, when Jesus had finished, it's after all these 5 discourses, Jesus had finished. I'm going to put him to the test and see. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, which is the first of the discourses, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed. That's 7:28. Here, when Jesus, I'm sorry, but I'm going to check him out because. But you see how you can't get things right and you can't all agree. But the thing is to notice them and be surprised and see how beautiful they are. And it happened when Jesus had finished all these words, he said to his disciples. That's literal translation. Okay, sorry, Henry. Tell you a story later on about last week, but we need to get on with this at the time being. Okay, now one of the things I haven't really mentioned enough is the relation between Jesus and Judaism, the gospel and Jewish faith. I've told you several times about fulfillment citations. This all happened to fulfill the text, and they quote the text. In other words, Matthew is saying to his people, or Matthew's gospel is saying to Christians, it's important that you see the connections with the Old Testament. Now, those people may well have been Jews who've become Christians, in which case I said, well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was wondering what we were going to do with our old scriptures. Okay? But it's also a statement for the whole church. Fulfillment. I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, says Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. I came to fulfill them. Okay, so we've got this positive attitude towards Judaism. Then there is the notorious chapter 23, which is a kind of diatribe against the scribes and Pharisees, about the teachers who put heavy burdens on people's backs, and you can read it if you want to. It's rather, I'm always pleased when during the week that we're reading chapter 23, there are saints' days, and you can have the saints reading instead, because I don't think Jesus was quite as tough as that. I think he was saying these Pharisees are wonderful people because they're trying to keep religion alive in a pagan empire. Anyway, that's just a personal opinion. But when we come to the Passion narrative, there is a very serious interest in where do the Jews stand, and above all, where does Judas stand? We do have in verse 3, chapter 26, verse 3, the high priest is named, Caiaphas, a very important high priest, was high priest for a very long time. It's only Matthew who names Caiaphas. The others just say the high priest. Okay? And then we have in 26:25, at the supper, Judas, the one who betrayed him, said, "Is it I, Master?" It's only in Matthew. Matthew is interested in Judas because Judas is the Jew. His name means Jew, and of course he's the one who betrayed Jesus, who arranged for the arrest of Jesus. Let's go, so when they go to the garden and Judas comes to embrace Jesus, and Jesus says, "Friend, why are you here?" Only in Matthew. So you see these extraordinary points at which, well, that's at the touch of this passion gospel. Okay. So much is this evangelist interested in Judas, that he gives us the account of Judas's death, suicide. This is in 27, 3 to 10, and it's very extensive. We don't know. There's big questions about the death of Judas, because in the Acts of the Apostles, he dies by another way. So, when you've got the scriptures disagreeing with each other, you've got to say, well, who knows? Who knows what the truth was? Okay. And at this point, when Judas goes to the chief priests and says he wants to give the money back, and it's thrown to the floor, "I have sinned in betraying," it's usually translated innocent blood. It's actually just blood. It's the word again, dikaion. Haima dikaion. I've betrayed just blood. Okay. Jesus as the just one. Acts of the Apostles, you find that. Okay. And if we move on further, 27:19, we have another character who's not in the other Gospels, and this is Pilate's wife. Now, Pilate's wife is a Gentile, okay, a non-Jew. And we think, oh, yes, we've had them, various points in the Gospel, but we had them at the very beginning, the Magi. So Matthew isn't exclusively focusing on Jews and how Jews should react, and that it's all the fulfillment. Generally thought that it's a gospel for Jewish Christians. That's the speculation. But here we have a Gentile who defends Jesus to her husband. And she says, "Do not you have anything to do with this just man? I've suffered," she has a dream, she's suffered much in a dream about him. He's a just man. Okay? Judas says, Pilate's wife says, he's just. Okay? And Pilate himself, 27:24, he washes his hands and he says, "I am innocent of the blood of this just man." Now, when you get the translation, you probably get righteous, you might get virtuous, but we want the same word to be translated in the same way. And when we get the revised New Jerusalem Bible, we hope we get just and justice, and all these things will be clear. But there will be other problems still remaining. You see, translation is a nightmare. The only thing is to learn Greek. At least with the Greek text, it's more or less reliable. When you get into the Old Testament, you're having nightmares like Pilate's wife. Okay, so the justice of Jesus is being subtly stressed by Judas, Pilate's wife, and by Pilate. Then we come, verse 24, the scene, you know it, you've seen it in some of these films of the Passion, the people calling for the death of Jesus, and in Matthew's Gospel alone, we have his blood be on us and on our children, which of course is a statement which has had the most dreadful consequences. And could we not forget that it was there? Could we not scrub it out? Because it seemed to give license to the persecutions of Jews, that they're all responsible. That's what it says in the Gospel. They invoked his blood. They were responsible for his blood. And they said, our children too take responsibility for his blood. And where does this come from? It's not in the other Gospels. Who knows? See, we've got to bear in mind, we've got a very complex situation being reported. How much of this is due to theology or the different ways in which these things are told, the theological points, Christological points that are being made, the anti-Jewish points that are being made? So there is the issue of anti-Judaism, anti-Jewishness in Matthew, also in John. That's one of the issues taken up in Christian-Jewish dialogue since the Second Vatican Council. So, I mean, we can exaggerate. We can say, well, we're not going to read that in our church because, or we can say maybe we need to be more sensitive to this and to make sure that these texts are disabled or explained properly when they are read. It's a bit like the diatribes against the scribes and Pharisees, about which we might feel a little bit uncomfortable. Okay. Right, so let's move towards what is a climactic statement. When Jesus dies, and there are various changes in the circumstances of the death of Jesus, Matthew has an extraordinary proliferation of statements of what happened. Whereas the other Gospels have the curtain of the temple being torn, he also has earthquake, rocks being split, graves opened, and resurrection of the saints and appearances to people in the city. Watch out for it on Palm Sunday. You know, when Jesus dies, this is what happens. Because when Jesus dies, this is what happens, but perhaps not in a historical way. It's pointing to, the consequence of the death and resurrection of Jesus is the resurrection of the saints, of those who have gone before us. And what is, I think, easy to miss in all of this is that in verse, so as part of the conclusion, the events after the death of Jesus, so we're talking about 27, talking about, okay, let me read it all. The veil of the sanctuary was torn in two, from top to bottom. That's verse 51. The earthquake, the rocks were split, the tombs were opened, the bodies of many holy people rose from the dead, and these, after his resurrection, came out of the tombs, entered the holy city, and appeared to a number of people. And then we have it, verse 54. The centurion, he's a pagan. I conclude we believe he's a pagan. He's a Roman centurion. I mean, he won't necessarily be Roman, but he's in the Roman army. Together with others guarding Jesus. Together with others guarding Jesus. not in Mark, okay? Not in Luke. The words that they say are slightly different. But what you've got here is an opening up of the Gentile world. At least that's the way it should be, I believe it should be understood. The centurion and those with him. They're the ones that now going to say this man was Son of God. Remember, Son of God, the disciples said it, Peter said it. And now this small group of people guarding Jesus say it. In the Passion of Johann Sebastian Bach, Matthew Passion, this has been noticed, and there is the most wonderful setting to music of this verse. The centurion and those with him, they, what's the first verb that we have? Guarding Jesus. When they saw the earthquake and all that was taking place, were terrified and said, that's all the narrator, okay? We're not reading this together here, but we should get this. We will get this in church on Palm Sunday. The narrator will say to you, all those people, the centurion, they were terrified and they said, and the whole congregation will come in truth this man was the Son of God. Right? And in Matthew Passion, it is the most extraordinary crescendo which goes right up to the, and then fades away. This man was the Son of God. This is not a Jew, this is not, a disciple. This is the centurion who's watching over his death and those with him, and they are stating the faith of the church, because the faith of the church is a faith not only of Jews but also of Gentiles. So you've got this extraordinary touch which you wouldn't notice unless you noticed it. In truth, this man is the Son of God. So if you've got Matthew Passion, best in German, get hold of it and just listen to that little bit. It's really quite extraordinary. Okay. And we'll have it. The potential to be surprised is there in our gospel reading on Palm Sunday. But the thing is, we don't notice enough. Yeah? But you'll be able to notice it this year. Okay. So, Son of God, the just one. Then we move on. Let's move on into the final chapter, the resurrection chapter, chapter 28. And what's unique about that is the final verses of Matthew's Gospel, where we have the appearance in Galilee. Now, the different Gospels, they're records of the appearances of the risen Jesus, which of course are crucial to explaining the outcome of all of this. They don't have they have different appearances. And so in 28, let's just okay. This is known as the Great Commission. The 11 disciples set out for Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, though some hesitated. That's a constant thing of resurrection appearances. Are you sure about this? I don't really know. No? So we're not gullible. We're not saying, oh yeah, wonderful. We say, oh, I don't know, is this true? Jesus came up and spoke to them. He said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, make disciples of all nations. So the gospel ends with these people who are with the centurion, these people who are unheard of, in ages still to come and in places you never heard of. No, they are to be brought the good news. They are to be made disciples. In other words, make them disciples, baptize them, and teach them to observe everything I've commanded you. And I am with you always, all the days until the end of time. I am with you, which ties up with the name Emmanuel. He is God with us at the very start of the gospel. So there are an extraordinary amount of things that we do not notice, so we're not surprised by them. We may be surprised when we notice something and think, I wonder how much more there is in this text. But I hope that through looking at some of the things that might surprise us in Matthew's Gospel, some of the riches that Matthew has added to the rich tradition of Mark, we will be able to hear it perhaps with new ears in a new way. And so once more, what did Benedict say? There's nothing more beautiful than to be surprised by the gospel. And Pope Francis, there's nothing more precious that we can give to others.